Todd Berry headed Wisconsin's only statewide charity dedicated to nonpartisan policy research and civic education, the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, of which he retired in January. For 25 years, he sought to teach, inform the public, press, and public officials about state and local government. Today, he will tell how the environment has changed and will offer remedies to polarization and dysfunction that range from common sense to wishful thinking. Todd was also a previous member of our club, and we're going to discuss why he is not current at a later date. We look forward to your presentation, and we've made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way to say thanks for speaking with us today. Remember, we have about 20 minutes, so I know there's a lot to unpack here with this polarization and dysfunction, but just want to remind you. As we welcome him to the podium, I want to remind everyone, if you have questions today, please wait for the audience microphones as the program is being recorded.
Thank you very much. Well, it's really good to be here, and I got to get all the appropriate equipment up here in front of me. I was a member of the club, and I do see a lot of familiar faces in the room, and so I say hello to everyone. As was mentioned, I have retired, and so I don't know, I haven't given many speeches in the last 3 months. It used to be about every day. Why am I no longer a member of Rotary? Because I had more makeups at other Rotary clubs than I had attendance at this one. Just a little bit about my background to shed light on what I'm about to say. I headed the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance for about 25 years, and as was mentioned, it's a nonpartisan research group that seeks to educate and inform the public about state and local government. And in addition to that, at various other times, I was in the Wisconsin Department of Revenue, on a school board, on the Dane County board, and sort of vicariously served in the legislature through my wife, who served 3 terms in the 80s and early 90s. So it's with that kind of background that I wrote a column that appeared in the Wisconsin State Journal, I think in the beginning of January. I conveniently planned my retirement trip to Costa Rica while the article ran so I could dodge any slings and arrows. And I will say some of the things I'm going to share with you today, you just aren't going to like and you're not going to agree with. They're really just personal observations. If we could go to the next slide. Oh, yes, that's right. I can control this. How about that? See, I'm really out of practice. So we talked about that. That column, by the way, ran in the State Journal, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, the Appleton Post-Crescent, a lot of other dailies and weeklies, and I also got interviewed on public radio and on Channel 3. So some of you may have heard a little bit about this discussion. The basic takeaway is that as I look at state government in Wisconsin now, as opposed to when I first interned in it in the early 70s and then went to work there, the thinking is very short term. The problem solving tends to be crisis to crisis. There's no doubt that there's polarization that never ends. There's a lot of gridlock, and it's not a very happy, friendly place. The Capitol, a lot of people who have served there will tell you that. Just to give you one example of the short-term thinking, and this is what prompted me to think about this, because I would talk about this with groups over the years. The state of Wisconsin financially sort of runs from crisis to crisis. We are supposed to have budgets that are adequately balanced to have reserves. Most experts want those to be 5 or 10% of spending. Wisconsin's lucky to be in the 0 to 2% range. We're a little bit higher now, but the legislative session isn't over and they're already busy spending it down. It's important because the economy goes up and down. You need to be prepared for emergencies, and yet for many, many years we've been incapable of doing that. And perhaps the best example is 2008. Going into the recession, the average state had in reserves 9% of what it was spending. Wisconsin was 0 to 1%, lowest in the country, except Arkansas. So we have a long, and I really have to stress here, bipartisan history of not behaving ourselves very well. In fact, when Governor McCallum was governor, he had put in the statutes a law that was going to require the state to keep a certain balance, and then Governor Doyle and Governor Walker, for many years thereafter, delayed the effective date of the law every time the budget was passed. So you can see there's not a lot of interest in behaving yourself. Other examples. We almost always pass state budgets where we spend more in the second year of the biennium than we bring in. So we almost always set ourselves up for some kind of budget problem going into the next budget. Another example, the state's rainy day fund, which is supposed to protect us in the case of really serious economic downturn. By the way, we didn't have hardly anything in that in 2008. And although the law has been in effect since '86, no governor or legislature has ever voluntarily deposited money in that fund. Now, you will see press releases talking about how deposits have been made, but they're only made to the extent that they're absolutely required by law. And I can think of 2, 3 times in the last 5 years when the state has simply decided that the law wouldn't take effect that year. So we don't have a very good track record of looking long-term, planning ahead financially, and it's not just finances. And I'm not going to spend any time on this, but other examples. Transportation. We've known we had transportation finance problems in this state for a very long time. Labor force issues. You hear a lot of talk about labor shortages now. We did a report back in 2004 at the Taxpayers Alliance talking about it and warning that by 2015 we would have a problem, and state basically did nothing. The school finance system in the state is just a collection of barnacles on top of barnacles on top of barnacles. Nobody understands it. It's a mess. And I won't get much into higher education, but we've got a way of governing higher education in this state that dates from the 50s, and we have a funding mechanism that doesn't look at all like it did in the 50s. So there's a lot of evidence of this sort of short-term thinking and gridlock not leading to problem solving. Now, I'm not going to say that it's all Wisconsin. Clearly, there are national forces at work. We have had a concentration of power moving from local governments to state to the federal government. That has raised the stakes of all problem solving and has made politics pretty irresolvable and pretty nasty. Other states, ditto. Illinois, I always used to say when I was speaking at groups around the state that thank God for Illinois, because no matter how Wisconsin happened to look, Illinois looked worse. And it's still true. Other states, California, New York, have been poster children. Detroit, Chicago, certainly examples on the city level. You know, the whole issue of nasty politics and polarization is not just a reflection of government, but I think you could generally say that the general level of discourse in American society isn't as kind and polite as it once was. However, I do think there are some things about Wisconsin that need to be said, and here's where I will say some things that some people don't like. I will tell you, by the way, my wife, a former legislator, will vigorously disagree with me on some of this. When you look around the country, though, what you see is according to people that study this stuff, there are about 10 states in the country, California, New York, Illinois, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. They're all fairly large states, populous and large geographically. Wisconsin is sort of the outlier and being smaller, but these are the states that are categorized by experts as having full-time professional career legislatures. This wasn't always the case in Wisconsin. And let me remember to advance this. The old profile for decades and decades in this state was you'd be a town chair, you'd farm, and you'd be a member of the state assembly, you'd be a member of the state senate, you'd be a school board member, you'd practice law, you'd be a homemaker, serve on a local city council or something, and be in the legislature as well. So the old profile, you had a variety of backgrounds and perspectives in the legislature. The new profile basically is dictated by a career path that for many, many folks in the legislature, and this is bipartisan too, looks like this. You go to college, you major in political science. Not economics, unfortunately. You get an internship at the Capitol, in a Capitol office. You graduate. You get a job on a Capitol legislative staff. You learn the ropes. You learn where the bodies are buried. You learn the issues. You learn how to raise money, how to run campaigns, and lo and behold, a seat opens up in a district of your interest, and you run, and you're more than likely to win. So the whole career path now is one that's very incestuous and really sort of an insider game. And so often these folks aren't coming to the legislature with any kind of life experience other than politics or family life experience. And so the whole perspective isn't as broad as it once was. Now, I'll be the first to admit that this career ladder extends. For instance, if you think about governors in Wisconsin, for quite a while now, they have tended to come out of the legislature, either directly or with a step or two in between. So what we've gotten with this sort of careerist kind of orientation is logical. People who have jobs like to keep jobs. So they're interested in self-preservation, which means the next election, which also means that the time horizon for these folks is pretty short, 6 months, 12 months. So there's not a lot of incentive to really look ahead, plan ahead, and so forth. The other thing that happens is the folks in the back benches owe their careers, in a sense, to the party leadership. So the power is very tightly concentrated in the party leadership, both sides of the aisle, and because it's the leadership that controls bill scheduling, committee assignments, committee chairmanships, and so forth. They also can have an effect in how money is guided to you or not to you, and they can also, if you're really bad, find a way to get you a primary. And I can think of examples on both sides of the aisle in the last decade. The other thing that's happened is the whole party system in Wisconsin has changed as well. We used to have these broad-based, volunteer-based, county-based political parties that were responsible for candidate recruitment. Money was coming through the parties, much more decentralized. Now, essentially, the organized political parties don't really get as active in all that stuff as the legislative parties. In that sense, it's really very much a parliamentary system where the legislative leaders are, in effect, the party for the purposes of recruiting candidates, funding them, and so forth. Clearly one consequence of the last 25 years has just been the career professional nature of the legislature. Another thing that's happened is that the elections are different too. We, of course, have had drawing of legislative districts in a sort of mischievous way, gerrymandering. This is bipartisan. I can remember in 1983 when the federal court had imposed legislative districts on Wisconsin. the Democrats came into power, repealed the federal court plan, and stuck a district plan in the middle of a 10-year census in the state budget. Now, we are more familiar, of course, with the 2012 gerrymander that the Republicans did that has gotten a lot of attention in the press and is working its way through the courts. But the point is, both of them are capable of it, and there's no reason to think it isn't going to continue to be so. The other thing that has really changed, though, is party primaries. The great so-called La Follette reform has, I would argue, turned into sort of a disaster, because now we have August primaries in summer. They're terribly low turnout affairs. The folks that tend to vote are the true believers. If you are a Democrat in Dane County, you run to the far left to get elected in a primary. If you are a Republican in Washington or Waukesha County, you run to the far right. Those are the candidates that tend to win those primaries, and then they come to Madison, and really they aren't accountable to the general electorate because they owe their election to this subset. And 2016 is just perfect proof of that. Half of the legislature in Wisconsin was reelected far before November. Half of them were unopposed except for maybe an independent or minor party candidate, either totally unopposed or unopposed after a primary. So the whole accountability notion of elections, the broad base of the electorate electing these folks has changed. So you put gerrymandering together with primary elections, and you really have a prescription for a lot of the gridlock we have, because you essentially elect folks from two armed camps on the fringes. They come to Madison with no incentive to work together or to compromise or to even be nice. And in fact, there are stories told around the Capitol of legislative leaders ordering folks in the rank and file not to socialize with members of the opposing party. So it's a different environment than what I knew. Ideological, not compromising, and so forth. So how do we solve this? And this is sort of where I'll wrap it up. Usually the first things out of people's mouths, and it may depend a little bit on your political persuasion, but one thing will be term limits. And, you know, if term limits is the only thing you're going to give me, I'll take it, although I think it throws the baby out with the bathwater. The other thing that will come out of other mouths is, well, if we just change campaign finance reform, everything would be good. The problem is we've had all sorts of campaign finance reform in Wisconsin and nationally, and the money always finds a way to still get to where it needs to go. The other thing about both of these is I don't think they get at the real structural issues. And the argument I'm going to make here is that how you design systems, how you structure things drives results. So where do we start? Redistricting reform would be good. There are models out there, whether it's Iowa or California. Primary reform, there are models for that too. Washington State has what's called a jungle primary. There aren't party primaries. Candidates all run together in one primary. The top two vote-getting candidates go to the general election. The beauty of that is, even in safe one-party districts, such as in Madison or in Waukesha County, you're going to have a general election with a contest offering voters a choice. And the signals from the electorate to candidates in terms of their philosophy is going to be a little bit different. You can accomplish the same thing with something like rank voting, where you list your preferences for an office and a series of automatic computer-generated runoff elections are run until you get a majority choice, It may be the second choice of more people, but it's going to be a broader base choice. Another idea that I think is really interesting that folks in Illinois are talking about again is a return to the old Illinois multi-member legislative district, where there might be 3 members in a district, you would have 3 votes. You could cast those for one candidate or spread them out any way you want. The term was bullet voting. The neat thing about that is it meant that if people were strategic, you could elect Republicans in Cook County. You could elect Democrats, in Republican strongholds outstate. Now, there would be 2 Democrats and a Republican, or 2 Republicans and a Democrat, but it really leavened the party caucuses because it brought urban Republicans in and rural Democrats in. Another thing that I think is worth thinking about is in the modern state Senate in Wisconsin, it's a place assembly people go to die. They have a great advantage running for the state Senate. So what if we were to prohibit candidates from running for one office while holding another? In other words, you don't get free shots. If you want to take a shot, you give up what you've got. Another idea, which is sort of anathema to Americans and Brits, but it's the notion of some kind of limited proportional representation where you would vote for a slate of candidates, and slates that were over 5% then would get a few seats on a statewide basis. That it helps minority parties and independents to some degree, I think. Another thing is the Republican and Democratic parties in Wisconsin have really fenced themselves in. They have created in election law pretty much a duopoly, which makes it much harder for independents and minor party candidates to run and be successful. So there are some possible ideas. A few more. Rather than limit terms, what if you were to fix the session lengths and fix the schedule of the sessions so people could plan to serve in the legislature and yet work outside the legislature? We have the technology to do committee work and hearings and so forth electronically. And these kinds of things mean it's possible to make the legislature, again, a part-time body. Now, I'm going to wrap up with some crazy ideas. This first one, you're going to go, this guy's insane. I remember when I was a young political science student, I also majored in French, so really. I was horrified that New Hampshire had 400 members in the New Hampshire House. But I'm beginning to think that if you tripled the size of the Wisconsin Assembly, it might have some really nice benefits. One is you have much smaller districts geographically and in terms of population, so they're easier to represent part-time. Second, it's more likely that the legislator and this constituent are going to know each other or have had some contact with each other just because of scale. It's going to be cheaper to run because the districts are much smaller. Mass media, outside money, and so forth aren't going to be terribly efficient. You're not going to buy Madison-wide TV to talk to one of 15 assembly districts in Madison, probably. So the old mass media attack ads probably go by the wayside. In addition to that, that got me thinking, what could we do with the state Senate? And these are equally crazy. The founders had a very different vision of an upper house than Wisconsin or other states. What about 1 8-year term or 2 6-year terms? And that's it. What about electing them in the spring in nonpartisan elections? What about having the districts not be contiguous with assembly districts so you can't have the Senate be in a place for assembly people to die? Maybe the Senate membership should not all be elected. What if former governors could serve one 10-year term or something like that. And here's a really crazy idea that goes back to the original Constitution. What if some kind of college or Congress of local officials elected a few members of the state Senate and sort of provide another kind of voice? So that's sort of it. The conclusion to this is, of course, this guy's nuts. He's living in la-la land, and in a sense you're right, because we do have a fox in the chicken coop situation. We're not going to change redistricting. We're not going to change election law. We're not going to make minor or independent parties candidates more viable because of the folks that are there. They're the fox in the chicken coop. The whole gun protests, incidentally, are showing the power of the grassroots, regardless of how you feel about the issue. The legislature, because it's a career body, is very paranoid. And so independent groups funding candidates and endorsing candidates, and particularly targeting a few incumbents and asking that they back the kinds of initiatives, some of these might change things. The other thing is we don't have initiative and referendum in this state, which I would say, thank God. Look at California if you want to see a fiscal mess due to referendum. But what if a statewide race was essentially a referendum on this stuff with a candidate saying, I'm running only because of this stuff. If you believe in it, vote for me. So that's sort of my take on all this, and I think we have some time for questions or arguments or whatever. Yes, sir.
Hi, Terry Anderson, Wisconsin Legislative Council. First of all, I have a comment and I have a question.
Yep.
The comment is the career path that you described of people getting into the legislature, while accurate, is accurate only for an extreme minority of the current membership of the Wisconsin legislature. By and large, they come from far other, more local avenues than having worked in an office or a career politician kind of setting. So I think that was a bit overstated on your part. Okay. The question I have...
I disagree with that.
Yeah.
But if you really look into the Blue Book and read their bios, right, and you'll see what they don't say, you find out a lot of them aren't what they pretend to be.
That all being said,
yeah, I was expecting.
Then the other thing I wanted to ask you, you brought up the very issue. I've had the opportunity to work in 2 different states, one of which is a legislature that pays its members $6,000 a year, limits its terms to its sessions to 40 days, has committees and floor sessions on the same day. Then I've come here and worked in this environment. While many of the things that you suggest are good things to be thinking about and implementing, you then also kind of belittled what I think is about the only way you're ever going to get them, and that was the initiative and referendum. Without that, you may hold California as an example, but I know full good and well there are states with the initiative and referendum, and that's how they got these reforms. Yeah. So how do we go about reforming this legislature where we don't have the initiative and referendum?
You know, if you were to give me initiative and referendum as the only route to get there, I might, consider it. It's just that the side effects have been so demonstrably awful in places like California, where all they really are is interest groups buy people to circulate petitions and then buy billions of dollars of advertising to promote their positions, and the notion that it's somehow bubbling up from the people ain't so. I should add though, and I don't entirely agree with your take on the membership, but I think there's a middle ground between the 2 experiences you've had. And if you look at the NCSL National Conference of State Legislatures profile of legislatures, you'll see that most of them fall between the group that Wisconsin fits in and a group that is more like you described. They're part-time, citizen legislators. There was a question somewhere back there, I think. Oh, over here. Okay.
First, as I recall,
Hi, Stuart.
Hi, Todd. First, as I recall, the most disruptive referendum in California was Proposition 13, which devastated the state finances, which I believe most of the so-called taxpayer groups supported. I also note that the return to citizen legislators with fixed terms would increase the power of lobbyists, such as yourself and your former colleagues. My question is, as I heard you say about not running for one office while holding another. As I understand it, you can't run for both the assembly and if you're an incumbent assemblyman, you can't run for the assembly and run for the Senate that same term. So are you suggesting that a representative would have to resign from the assembly in order to file for the Senate, or what else does your proposal mean?
The other possibility is we have a lot of special elections which give representatives free shots. We have people in nonpartisan offices getting free shots at the legislature. By the way, I have to correct what you said. First of all, you suggested the Taxpayers Alliance was a taxpayer group in the context of Jarvis or something in California. We never were, and still haven't been. We were always a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3. We had never done any lobbying. No one had ever been registered as a lobbyist. And in fact, in my 25 years, I can probably count on a couple hands the number of times I was in the Capitol. Only at the request of a committee and only to testify for information only. Other questions? Okay, and some of you I know have to scoot, and I understand that.
Hi, Todd. I'm Ellen Foley.
Hi.
Nice to see you. The millennials tend to be a collection of people in a very vast generalization who don't join, who aren't going to be bossed around by the party. Do you think that they, coming into the legislature, will make a big change?
Well, the average age of the legislature, which had dipped quite markedly in the 70s and 80s, has now turned back up. I mean, you've got some folks that have had legislative careers that are 20, 25 years or longer. So, I mean, the turnover will come slowly, I think. I also think the whole millennial life cycle seems to be delayed in part by economic circumstances and so forth. I think of my 3 adult children, all pushing 30 or in their 30s, and none of them are in the circumstance to consider doing something like that in the near term, even though they grew up with a mother as a state legislator. So, but you know, we can hope, and I think generalizations about the millennials are perhaps overdone, and I think they'll probably start to look, in some ways, more and more like the rest of us as time progresses. But you know, they're going to have some different takes. So, I don't know. Anything else? I don't know how much more time we have.
I've got one over here.
Oh.
Hi, Todd. Mark Clear, member of the Madison City Council,
Yes.
but not that that has anything to do with anything. But one
and the owner of a business who has pitched me, by the way.
a long time ago. I'm
Yeah.
shocked that you remember that.
Oh, yeah.
So one thing you didn't mention is limits on the power of legislative leadership.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think rather than try to do it directly, you try to structurally change the institution so that they don't become as centrally powerful, because you're not depending on the job for your livelihood. You're going to have much more diversity, one would hope, in background, geography, philosophy, and that those kinds of things would lead to different kind of leadership elections, the kind we had in Wisconsin, you know, back in the 60s, 70s, and so forth.
Hello. You identified a barrier to the younger generation being engaged, and that's the crushing student debt.
I didn't identify that. That's one thing.
Well,
But
that's what I'm very conscious of, is that if you're busy worrying about working 2 jobs to pay off your student loans, you have less time to be a civic person.
true.
If we really wanted to do something about it, I think we should explore a jubilee year for student debt. You're laughing. But that would free up so much income and generate so much potential, and no one ever talks about it. I had the luxury of my mother-in-law sending my kids through college, but the crushing debt that my nieces and nephews have is overwhelming their ability to have a life and contribute to a society that needs them.
Sure, sure. I won't address that. My PhD is in higher ed finance, and I can argue both sides of this at length. I think the issue is a lot more nuanced and has a lot more other factors going on than you might suggest, but we'll leave it at that. So.